Hello and welcome everybody to this last talk of our current Primate Conversation series. I'll just mention now that they will return rather in April with Julie Lesnick giving a talk, the first talk on the 27th of April. It's a pleasure to welcome our final speaker of this Primate Conversations series, Lisa Horn. Lisa is a Mary Yehuda Fellow at the Department of Behavioral and Cognitive Biology at the University of Vienna. With her combined background of zoology and psychology, Lisa has been exploring social cognition in humans and non-human animals, and has studied mechanisms for social bonding and pro-social behavior in various taxa, including dogs and corvids. And I know we're looking forward to hearing Lisa's share her work on pro-social behaviour and corvids today, and providing for many of us a much needed broader taxonomic perspective on the evolution of pro-sociality. Lisa completed her master's at the University of Vienna on social learning of domestic dogs, and also at her current institute, her PhD, where she explored mechanisms for social bonding in context of human-dog relationships and also social cognitive abilities of dogs. Lisa has since been involved in multiple projects at the University of Vienna, as well as completing postdoctoral work at the Max Planck Institute of Evolutionary Anthropology, the University of Milan, and the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. And these are just a few examples, which include investigating both physiological and social factors of pro-social behaviour in children, exploring cross-cultural differences between dog-human relationships across Europe, and allopreening in parrots and corvids and the implications for maintaining social bonds. Lisa's talk today aligns very much with her current investigation into the evolution of pro-sociality across taxa, but she's also exploring synchrony and movement and implications for social bonding, so watch this space. We look forward to hearing more about it, maybe at a future talk. So welcome, Lisa. I'm going to now pass over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction and also for this exciting opportunity to be part of this wonderful lecture series here today. Today, I want to talk to you about why corvids, so a bird group, could be an interesting model for investigating the evolution of pro-social behavior. But before I dive right into this topic and try to convince you with my empirical evidence, I also want to give you a little bit of broader background of what my scientific interests and my lines of research are. So what has fascinated me from the very beginning of my scientific career is actually social cognition, not only in humans, but as we heard beforehand, also in non-human animals. And I've investigated social relationships and how they actually shape social cognition, but also things like interpersonal coordination and cooperation, as well as very recently competition between individuals, and also which factors of social relationships influence these behaviors. And last but not least, I've long been interested now in pro-social behavior, other regarding behaviors, and what prerequisites are important for pro-social behavior, but also what are its consequences. And as we heard very nicely, the model taxa that I've looked at have been very diverse, ranging from pet dogs via humans, adult humans and children, to birds, more specifically corvids. And in my talk today, I want to focus specifically on this one part of my research, namely on prosociality in corvids. And as often the case in science, not much of this work that I'm going to present you today would have been possible to do only on my own. I'm really happy that I had a great team of like-minded scientists to embark on this journey with me. First and foremost, Thomas Bogner and Joch Massen, whom I've worked with at the Department of Behavioral and Cognitive Biology at the University of Vienna, together with a team of equally enthusiastic students. But as the project that we did on prosociality in corvids grew, we also got other corvid labs around the globe on board, and they joined this endeavor For example, a group around Michael Grieser at the University of Zurich, a team around Auguste von Bayern at the Max Planck Institute for Ornithology in Seewiesen, a group around Eiji Itzawa at Keio University in Tokyo, as well as a group and a team around Alex Taylor at the University of Auckland. But now if I want to jump into my topic of prosociality, I should probably first talk about what does this actually mean. And I have to say that across different disciplines, there have also been different definitions of what prosociality means, but there's one that I find particularly useful when doing comparative work, which states that prosocial behaviors are all voluntary actions that benefit another individual with no gain for, but also at no or low costs to the actor. And such behaviors can range from sharing food with another individual and or helping another individual achieve a goal. Especially this first part here about whether these actions are voluntary or not, I find that this part is the most important part to investigate for us scientists, and we can usually design clever little control conditions to really make sure whether the acts are done voluntarily or maybe not so much as in this picture here. The lower two parts of this definition about the no or low costs or the no gain are specifically meant to distinguish prosocial behavior from other behaviors, like for example altruism, true altruism, which usually incurs a cost to the actor. So for example, if I only have one piece of cake and I give you this whole piece of cake, then I would be very, very altruistic towards you. And no gain is used to distinguish prosocial behavior from cooperation, which is an act where also I benefit another individual, but at the same time, I benefit myself because together we can achieve a goal better than each of us could do it alone. But especially this last part, that there is no immediate gain to the actor, especially when the act of prosociality is performed towards a not related person or maybe even a complete stranger, as we often have it in humans. This has puzzled scientists quite a lot because it raises the questions, how did this prosocial behavior evolve then? There are many different theories that have been put forward that might help explain how prosociality came to be in our lineage. For example, the theories that stress the importance of collaborative foraging or specifically hunting, but also theories that emphasize the emergence of cultural conventions or norms. But today I want to focus on two different hypotheses that are very useful, I think, when looking at prosociality from a comparative angle. The cooperative breeding hypothesis states that the degree of allomaternal care that exists in humans, for example, and what do we mean with allomaternal care? So it's other individuals from my group, other than the mother, helping to raise offspring. And this degree of allomaternal care, this emergence of allomaternal care, changed some cognitive mechanisms and us that also then brought about these general prosocial tendencies. On the other hand, there is the self-domestication hypothesis, which states that prosocial behavior is almost like a byproduct of reduced aggression rates within the group and increased social tolerance rates within the group. And I just want to note here that throughout my talk, I'm going to use the same color coding that I use here already. So everything that has somehow related to the cooperative breeding hypothesis, I will put in orange, and everything that is related somehow to the self-domestication hypothesis, I will put in green. There is actually experimental evidence that supports both of these hypotheses, specifically in primates. Burkhardt and colleagues, for example, tested 15 different primate species, including humans, for their prosocial behavior, and they found that the degree of allomaternal care predicted the degree of prosocial tendencies best in these primate species. However, one caveat here is that cooperative breeding, so the degree of maternal care and cooperative breeding by whole groups, is relatively rare in primates and actually only exists in two groups, namely in humans and in callitrichid monkeys. On the other hand, for the self-domestication hypothesis, Brian Hare and colleagues have done a series of different experiments where they showed that bonobos, who are more tolerant than their closely related chimpanzees, are usually outperforming chimpanzees in pro-social tasks, thereby lending support to the argument that the more a species is self-domesticated, or the more it is tolerant and the less it is aggressive, the more pro-social this species also is. However, here it is very difficult to really make clear how you measure social tolerance, especially in socially very complex species like bonobos and chimpanzees. So how can you really find one measure that tells you how tolerant a species is? That's why I want to argue today that maybe there's this new model system of the Corvids that might be very well suited for investigating both hypotheses, actually. But first, maybe let me start. You might ask me, what is a corvid? What am I talking about? Corvids are long-lived, relatively long-lived, large-brained songbirds that comprise, for example, ravens, crows, magpies, and jays. And they are really known for their advanced social cognition, like perspective taking, cooperation, but they also form strong and individualized social bonds with other individuals in their groups. And what is really exciting about them is that the last common ancestor of corvids and primates, for example, lived 320 million years ago. So whatever interesting traits we are going to find in our investigation will probably, very likely, most likely, I would say, be the product of convergent evolution. What makes them particularly interesting with regard to the cooperative breeding and the self-domestication hypothesis is that corvids also show a very high diversity in their social systems that they live in, particularly when it comes how they raise offspring, so how they breed and how they nest. Let me illustrate this for you for a moment here. So a typical breeding unit in a typical corvid species, like you can see here, a pair of ravens, is the breeding pair. So the mother and the father of the offspring contribute together to offspring care. Although one has to say that the female usually incurs somewhat greater costs than the male because she needs to produce the eggs, and in most species she is also more involved in incubating the eggs. This breeding pair in this typical species will defend a territory, a rather large territory, where they will have their nest and they will raise the offspring, and they will defend it against other breeding pairs that have their separate territories. In some species, like you can see here, the New Caledonian crows, the parents will tolerate the offspring to stay within the parental territory for a little bit longer, although they would be mature already. And you can talk about the kind of family living system in this respect. But again, in other species, what you will see that also offspring might stay behind in the parental territory, but not breed themselves. But also unrelated birds might be in the territory and actually help the breeding pair to raise the offspring without raising offspring themselves. And here we can talk about a cooperative breeding system. And why this is particularly interesting in corvids, because actually a large number, roughly 40% of all corvid species, show this cooperative breeding system, and these are also species from different genera, not from one genus. Therefore, this is a very good starting point for investigating the cooperative breeding hypothesis. There is, however, yet another interesting part about corvids, because some corvids don't defend these large territories, but they actually nest in very close proximity to one another. So you can here see it in rooks, where they actually nest in the same tree, and you have a nest here and a nest here, so very close together, which arguably means that they must be quite a bit more tolerant and less aggressive towards their conspecifics than, for example, a pair that nests in large territories. This, on the other hand, is a very nice opportunity for investigating the self-domestication hypothesis, which highlights the importance of this increased social tolerance. But what do we know what did we know until recently about prosociality in corvids? In our lab, we have investigated common ravens for many, many years and know from behavioral observations that they do actually share food with important social partners, and they also console social partners, so they help social partners after conflicts. But interestingly, when my colleagues started to test the common ravens for their pro-social tendencies in experimental paradigms, they found very, very little evidence for pro-social tendencies, for pro-social behavior. But if we go back to my slide before, then we maybe remember that ravens are actually not the ones that are cooperative breeders, and they also live in large territories and defend them against others. So the question remained, maybe they are not the most suitable species for investigating prosociality. That's why in 2014, my colleague Jörg Massen had the idea to actually add another species to our lab, namely the azure-winged magpies. And what makes them so special? Azure-winged magpies live in East Asia and live in flocks of up to 20 birds. They are rather small corvids, I have to say, so a little bit smaller than our Eurasian magpies. But what is really special about them is that they actually show cooperative breeding in the wild with related as well as non-related helpers at the nest, but equally they also live in close colonies. So they are also very tolerant towards their group members and nest in very close proximity. How we tested prosociality in these birds was by adapting a paradigm that had been developed by Burkhardt and colleagues for primates, namely the group service paradigm. The nice thing about the group service paradigm is that individuals can be tested in their regular enclosure, in the regular social group, and they only have to operate a very simple mechanism in order to make food available to the group. So you can see here the picture, what we actually used for the birds, since they have no hands for operating anything, we used the seesaw mechanism, where a bird could land on the seesaw mechanism and make food available like this. So in the pro-social test, the most important test condition, what we did is that we put food here on the right side, and by landing on the provisioning perch, an individual could make food available to any potential other recipient that could land here and take the food. Very important, the individual had to stay in this position until another bird arrived to take the food. And also, most crucially, the bird landing on the perch could never obtain the food itself, because as soon as the bird would leave the perch, the apparatus would move back again in the other position and the food would be out of reach. I would like to show you a video to illustrate this. So what you will see is that you will basically see exactly the setup of the apparatus. And first, you will see me entering and actually place the food on the apparatus on the other side. And first, one bird will arrive and will land on the provisioning perch, but actually no other bird will come in time, and the bird will fly off again. And then the same bird will make another attempt and land, and at that time wait until another individual comes. So now you can see me I bring the food. It's a little cricket for the azure-winged magpies. I show them that there's food available and leave again. And one bird actually lands, waits for a while, but no other bird arrives. And then the same bird comes back, waits again, and by now another bird is well coordinated in time, picks up the food, and once the food is consumed, they both fly off again. What is important to mention here is that the measures that we took in this pro-social test was, on the one hand, the number of food pieces that were actually provided to the group members, namely the food provisioning, but also, as you could see, sometimes birds attempted to provide food, but there was just no recipient that came there at the same time. So as a second measure, we also took all of the attempted food provision, or all of the attempted landings on the provisioning perch, as a second measure. And these two measures will come back over and over again in the rest of my talk now. Of course, it was very important for us to also make sure that the birds did not only land on the apparatus because there was food present and they could not inhibit landing there. So we also conducted two control conditions. On the one hand, an empty control. The procedure was exactly the same. I went there, I tilted the apparatus, but there was actually no food on the apparatus. And if the birds would land to provide food, we would not expect them to land in this empty control condition. And we also additionally conducted a blocked control condition where there was food on the apparatus, but the access to the food, the access to the food was blocked with a fine wire mesh. So there was food, the food could be sliding forward, but nobody could obtain the food. So again, if the landing was mainly done for other individuals to obtain the food, then also in this block control, the bird should not land on the apparatus. We tested two groups of azure-winged magpies, one with 5 and one with 4 individuals, and found in generally that most of the food was delivered throughout the experiment, with very few exceptions. But of course, we also wanted to make sure that we only counted food that was delivered by individuals that passed these controls. So individuals that really landed only in the test, but not in the two control conditions, because we wanted to make sure to really only count provisioning by individuals that had enough inhibitory control and were not just landing whenever anything happened with the apparatus. Actually, from the 9 individuals, 4 individuals passed these individual controls. So in the one group, almost all of the food was provided by such knowledgeable individuals, 98%. And in the other group, one of the individuals did not pass the probe, so 64% of the food was delivered. And also what we could see nicely in the azure-winged magpies, that also on a group level, actually, the birds landed far more often in the test than both in the empty and in the blocked control. So what we argued after this first paper was that, yeah, so there seems to be a positive effect, but of cooperative breeding alone or also of colonial nesting, we didn't know. So what we really needed to do is that we needed to go out there and needed to test more corvid species. So for a big corvid comparison, we added some more species. So we started out with the azure-winged magpies that I already mentioned, who are cooperative breeders and who nest in close colonies, meaning that they are also more tolerant towards others than territorial birds. We added another species that breeds cooperatively but does not nest in colonies, the carrion crows. And we added 2 species that nest in colonies but do not breed cooperatively. Additionally, we had 4 species that showed neither cooperative breeding nor colonial nesting: the common ravens, large-billed crows, New Caledonian crows, and Siberian jays. Where here, on the right-hand side, the New Caledonian crows and Siberian jays are interesting in this respect that they show some family living. So they tolerate offspring around in their territories for longer, but this offspring doesn't help in raising the next year's offspring or the siblings. Also, what I have to mention is that one of these species was tested in the wild, while all the others were tested in captive settings. But with a bit of tinkering around, we could actually adapt our apparatus so that we could use the same apparatus and the same setup in the wild as well. In total, we tested 72 birds. For 3 of the species, we had 2 groups. And what you can see here in the gray letters is from all of the birds that we tested, how many actually we managed to train to use this apparatus, because you can imagine that to use the seesaw, we first needed a bit of time to, in a way, explain to them how it works. So regarding the food provisioning, what did we find? We have the values of 98% and 64% that we already had from our previous study in the azure-winged magpies. In the other cooperative breeders, the carrion crows, we had also quite high percentage of provisioning, namely 57%. In the colonial birds, we had somewhat smaller numbers. 26% in the jackdaws and 2% in the rooks. For the rooks, I just briefly want to point out that, as you might have seen, so we had only 3 individuals that passed the training, so that learned how to use the apparatus, when actually we started out with 12 individuals. So this was a really large group of rooks, where unfortunately after many sessions of training, only 3 individuals did approach the apparatus as well. So with the 2% of the rooks, we are just really not sure whether that's maybe due to just not being enough donors and recipients to actually work this task. In the non-cooperative breeding and non-colonial nesting birds, we had, again, like intermediate numbers, 21% and 60 in the common ravens and 16% in the large-billed crows. In the New Caledonian crows and Siberian jays, we had like mostly zeros, although we have here like one group of the New Caledonian crows that stuck out with 70% of food provisioning. So really high number. And I want to come back to this information later at the end of my talk. But keep this in mind. When we then looked at the landings on the perch, we calculated a model and took into account for each individual whether they came from a cooperatively breeding species or from a colonial versus a territorial species. But because we've seen in previous experiments and behavioral observations that there are sex differences in food sharing in many corvid species, we also included sex, the individual sex, into this model as well. And indeed, what we found was that there were significant interactions of an individual sex with both the positive effect of cooperative breeding and the positive effect of colonial nesting. So let me walk you through these results here. We start with the cooperative breeding, and here we found that this positive effect of cooperative breeding, the cooperative breeders here are marked in orange, and this positive effect of cooperative breeding was actually driven by the females. You have here on the side, you have the female birds, and here you see a large difference between the cooperatively breeding versus the not cooperatively breeding birds. Whereas in male, we didn't see this difference at all. The positive effect of colonial nesting, with that effect, it was actually the opposite. So I have the colonially nesting birds marked in green. And here we could see the positive effect. So more landings actually in the birds that come from colonially nesting species compared to males that come from territorial species. Whereas we didn't see a significant difference in the females, and if, then a trend rather in the opposite direction. So what can these results tell us about the evolution of prosociality? We have what we found was that most food provisioning happened in the cooperative breeders, with one exception that I will come back later. And we had a positive effect of cooperative breeding, but that was mainly driven by the females, which was a bit surprising for us, because if you look at cooperative breeding in the wild, then it's actually often the male birds that help a lot out at the nest. But on the other hand, if you remember back to when I talked about the breeding unit, what happens is that the females incur somewhat more cost. So they are usually more dependent on this cooperative breeding system to be stable and to work out. And they help us really helping her at the nest, because they also feed her, not only the chicks after they are hatched, but they also feed her while she's incubating, for example. So we are suggesting that maybe in cooperative breeders, actually the females are very dependent on this cooperative breeding system to work, and therefore might be using these pro-social acts to actually keep other birds happy and keep the group together. On the other hand, the colonial nesting effect was driven by the males. And here we were really thinking back to the original self-domestication hypothesis. So really thinking that in this early stages, what was the most important factor was the reduced aggression and the higher tolerance. But even in the original theories, a lot of more emphasis was put on reduced aggression in the males than in the females, because normally there are more aggressive encounters between males, and also in corvids the males are in most species more dominant than the females, for example. So it's possible that especially in colonial nesting, it's important that the males become tolerant, and that might make them also be more pro-social in the long run. However, we have to say that to really answer this question, we would have to go out and test far more species, because we have now seen a glimpse of the possibility, but we really would like to expand this even more and look at this in more detail. And also what I have to say that, of course, these two theories are not mutually exclusive, because one thing that both cooperative breeding and colonial nesting requires is that you are somewhat socially tolerant towards other close to your nest. Because in cooperative breeding, the breeding pair has to tolerate the helpers that come every now and then and provide food, for example, for the incubating female or the offspring. And in colonial nesting, you have to tolerate another breeding pair really close to your own nest, which is not the case in territorial species. So one way to think about it is that maybe this increased tolerance around the nest that we have in both of these systems might facilitate the evolution of prosociality. Now, to wrap this up a little bit, these studies, I want to come back to the open questions, because as I said, so one thing that really puzzled us very much was the 70% of provisioning in one group of the two tested groups of New Caledonian crows. And we are wondering, I talked about this briefly in the beginning, that these New Caledonian crows, they do live in family groups, so they tolerate their offspring around for longer periods. So whether maybe this, and also what I want to say is that family living has often been argued to be kind of a stepping stone towards cooperative breeding, because first I allow my offspring to stay in my territory a little bit longer, and then maybe eventually the offspring might pay to stay in my territory even longer by starting to help out with offspring care. So what we're really interested in the future is whether there is also like the family living is an important factor for pro-sociality. What I haven't touched upon until now is the difference between proactive versus reactive pro-sociality. So what do I mean by this? The question is whether an individual offered the food out of its own motivation, let's call it like this, or whether an individual just reacts towards another individual begging for the food. And for example, in the group service paradigm, you can look at this nicely by looking whether a bird landed on the provisioning perch when there was nobody in the waiting position, or whether the bird landed when there was another individual already sitting in the waiting position. And what we found, for example, in the Azure-winged magpies, very much like you saw in the video as well, that 96% of the deliveries were proactive. So actually the donor first went there and waited, sometimes for really, really long time, until somebody else came and delivered the food. Whereas in the common ravens, for example, where anyway not so much food was delivered, but from these food deliveries, only 26% of the food deliveries were proactive, whereas in the other percent, there was an individual, mostly the dominant individual, already sitting in the position, waiting for another bird to come and deliver the food. And this like ties in with another point that I find very interesting, namely the effect of social relationships on this pro-social behavior. And to take again the example of the ravens, there we did find actually difference, especially who received the food. And we found that males received significantly more food, and also dominant birds received significantly more food. So I think this is a really important open question as well, to look in far more detail, not only are they providing food, but also like how much of the food, who is the one who provides the food and who is the one who receives the food. And I think that ties everything together nicely with my own interests that are, as I said in the beginning, not only about prosociality in corvids, but in the last years, I have been really become more and more interested to tie these things that interest me together by looking at social relationships together with pro-sociality and cooperation and competition, and really go into more closely related species, namely human, and here specifically human children, and where I try to use experimental setups that are as closely modeled as possible to the setups that we use in animals, in non-human animals, and look at how children share, how they cooperate, but also how this degree of sharing and cooperation depends on their natural relationships in their natural groups. With this, I would like to wrap up my talk and thank you all very much for your attention. And of course, I thank my funding agencies, and I would be very happy to take questions.
Great, thank you so much, Lisa. That was a really fascinating talk. And I think it's always so interesting and good for us primatologists to hear about different species and different approaches to a comparative understanding of the evolution of social behaviors and prosociality. So we have a few questions that have come in. We have a couple on cooperative breeding. So the first is, for the cooperative breeders, has there been exploration with how related they are to each other?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there is to some extent more relatedness between cooperatively breeding species, because as I said before, so there's two different types of helpers that are usually there at the nest. So on the one hand, you will have offspring that stayed behind in the territory and helps, but on the other hand, you also have these unrelated helpers, and the degree of how often you have these cases of unrelated helpers differs between different species. But for example, in the Azure-winged magpies, you have this is very common to also have unrelated helpers. But of course, what we would need would definitely be studies on actually relatedness. So we would have to get the genetic material and get the relatedness and see whether they are more related, more closely related than non-cooperatively breeding species. For our sample that we work with, we have to say that unfortunately we would have really loved to include this factor as well, especially when looking at the relationships, like who provides for whom, whether, for example, kin provide more than non-kin. But unfortunately, for quite a few of our species, we did not have the data on this. So we did not know whether the birds were related or they were not related, because some of them came from zoo populations, some of them came from the wild. But that's definitely a really important point, even within our samples, to look at in the future, for example, whether there's a difference between kin and non-kin.
Yeah, sounds like lots of material for future studies. The other question on a similar topic is, which species would you now like to study in order to investigate the effect of sex on cooperative breeding and prosociality?
All of them, if it would be possible. So I think we set out with really ambitious goals to test like not all corvid species possible, but to test even more species. But it is actually difficult to do these studies. So there are not so many labs in the world that work with corvids and that have corvids in a captive setting that can be worked with well. Although, as we saw with the Siberian chase, so it was also possible to adapt our setting to the wild and use the same on the wild. So maybe that would be an avenue to go. So I'm sure that like, for example, the jays, like pinion jays, would be a wonderful addition, because there are studies showing that in the dyadic setting, there is pro-social behavior between them. But I think testing especially more cooperatively breeding species, I think that's an important point. If we want to see this this influence of sex on especially the cooperative breeders, we would just need to add more species here.
Yeah. Yeah, so we have another question on the nature of relationships between the birds. So do you think that long-term relationships are necessary to develop prosocial behaviors? And if so, how can you eliminate the possibility of a future gain to the actor?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is a very important point that is always the question as soon as you work with natural groups. So, and it really, this is different from a lot of psychological studies on pro-social behavior, where we really get people in and you use these one-shot games where they really don't know who's the other one. As soon as you move in a social group, of course, it is very possible that there is paying back in other currency, like that there is, for example, I don't know, that you shared food with me yesterday, so today I deliver for you in the group service paradigm. However, I'm not sure whether these effects are so singular, so that really like the individuals would go like, you did one thing for me, that's why I do something for you here. But rather, I think it ties back to the beginning of the question. It might tie back to their general social relationships. So this is, for me, one of the most important points to really look into much more, like, because what is really interesting about the corvids is that they have these complex relationships outside of the breeding pair. So it's not only the breeding pair whom they have a valuable relationship with, but they also have other individuals who are friends, you could say. So very close friends or not so close friends. Often they really hang out a lot with their brothers or sisters. So that's like one thing, but sometimes they also pick another individual and that individual is their best friend. And this is, I think this is very similar also to the apes, to the chimpanzees and bonobos, where you see that having these relationships is really valuable for you and might then also mean that these buddies, these friends share also more with each other when you look into the when you look into pro-social behavior in an experimental setting. So for our corvid species that we have here in Vienna, we have very detailed information about who's friends with whom, who's like in the very beginning. You mentioned the study about so the study that I was involved with about the grooming and the allopreening. So we kind of know who sits with whom, who preens whom, which is the equivalent of the grooming behavior. So this is work in progress, so I can't spoil too much about this, but we are also looking into whether these relationships actually affect who was the donor, so who provided the food and who received the food in the end.
Yeah, I think we'll all be interested to see what comes out of that work. And the relationships, the friendships between individuals sounds very similar to anyone studying primates, I'm sure. So the next question is on the self-domestication hypothesis. Do you think that the self-domestication hypothesis in Corvids could be tested looking for signals of positive selection in the genomic regions associated to domestication in mammals?
This is a tricky question. Let me just step back because this is not my expertise. But I think, yeah, I mean, I think it would be interesting because I'm not sure how much of this work has been done outside of the mammals. Although we do have very nice like systems for domestication also in the birds, like the chicken, for example, compared to the wild type. And I do know of behavioral studies about this. I have to say that unfortunately, I don't know so much about the genetic studies. But whoever asked this question, if you're out there and you have this idea, I think it would be a great opportunity to go in this direction, because to my knowledge, I don't think that somebody has done it, definitely not in Corvids.
Yep, sounds like a good project for someone in genomics. So moving on to a question on kind of cheaters and punishment in these behaviors. So for individuals that don't operate the seesaw, you could say they can be seen as cheaters. Do others work for them, or are they discriminated against?
So one thing that I have to say, because I got these questions earlier, was also how much coercion is involved in this group service paradigm, because there is a study in parrots, so not in corvids, but in parrots, where they also used a kind of a mechanism where one individual had to sit somewhere and then there was food available. And there in the Kia, they found a lot of coercion, so that basically the dominant shoot the other one up there on this perch. In the seesaw apparatus, how we used it, this coercion was not really easily possible. So we didn't see this, maybe just because of the spatial allocation of the two positions. But what we rather saw is that, for example, in the ravens, the dominant birds would be just very persistent and kept sitting in the receiving position until eventually somebody maybe sometimes provided something. So I think it is a really interesting question if you think about what happens afterwards, like if maybe you look, not because so far we have concentrated a bit more also for the work that is in progress now on the social relationships that already exist between the individuals, or whether an individual is dominant, but we have not really so much looked at the consequences of the pro-social giving or the lack of pro-social giving. So whether we would then see that individuals that gave a lot during the task would afterwards also be treated in a nice way. I think with the not giving, it is difficult because it's such an open setting. So it's basically we installed this apparatus in the normal living enclosure, and the individuals were completely free to come and work with this apparatus or decided to go somewhere else and do something else. So it would be interesting for me also to think about how the other group members perceived an individual that was not providing, whether they actually perceived it as withholding a potential act of pro-sociality, or the bird was just not there. So whether that would be like not providing in a group service paradigm would be a punishable act for corvids, I unfortunately cannot conclude for certain.
I guess this is in a similar vein. Someone asks, do you ever see interventions or punishments if the donor gives food to the wrong partner?
Mm-hmm. No, we did not really. I mean, apart from tiny anecdotes where I could have thought, what happened there right now? Mm-hmm. We did not really see like clear punishing behavior if for example one individual took the food. So in ravens, as I said, the dominant ones were the ones who received more, and there we did see that if a not so dominant bird snuck in and got a piece of food, then maybe this bird got afterwards chased away and said like, oh, what are you doing here? Why are you taking the food? But what I would not remember seeing was any punishment of the donor, because the donor would have given the food to the wrong individual. I'm just afraid that the group service paradigm in its in this type of open setting that it is in which it is structured, it doesn't lend itself very well to investigating these differences. So I would rather think, for if you want to investigate this question, it would be rather interesting to go into a dyadic setting, or maybe a choice setting, where you give the individual the choice: do I provide to one individual or rather the other? And then you could afterwards see what's the reaction of the guy that didn't get anything. Will you see kind of punishment for not sharing the food?
Yeah, definitely more future avenues for research, and again, quite comparable to some of the primate research we see going on. So on that note, the next question is on experimental design, and someone's wondering if there's a risk that in the no food condition, individuals think food is actually there, similarly to when a dog thinks you have a treat because you put out your hand or put your hand in a treat bag and take it back out. So is it possible that they wouldn't be able to identify that there was no food until they'd come close and landed on the seesaw in the no food condition?
Yeah, I mean, what because now I went through the methods more so quicker for this presentation. Of course, there's far more detail about our methods in the papers actually, but what we did is that we actually conducted 5 sessions of all of these conditions, of the test condition, of the empty control, and of the block control, and we did not, for the main analysis, we did not count these initial 3 sessions where they actually acquired this understanding of that, for example, in the no food condition, there is no food being placed there, but we focused on the last 2 sessions where we could be relatively sure that the individuals understood already in the no food condition there is no food, and in the normal prosocial test, for example, there is food. So definitely I agree, they needed some time. So what we saw in the slopes, for example, was that in the azure-winged magpies, the landing rate in the prosocial test stayed almost 100% throughout all 5 sessions, whereas in the no food, in the empty control condition, they started out with a lot of landings, but then you could see the learning curve that they learned, there is nothing there, so I don't have to learn, and very similar in the block control. So they didn't understand it from the very first trial on, but very quickly they understood, either there's no food or food cannot be made available. So it is true that if they would have confused this all the time, then basically we would have no individuals that would have passed this knowledge probe. So this is why for us it was very, very important to introduce this knowledge probe of actually only including the data from those individuals that passed this understanding, so that didn't confuse the situation with there is no food, but that actually landed only when there was food available for the other individuals.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I have to say, I was impressed with the ones that could pass the knowledge probe of understanding when the food wasn't there, when that mesh was there. So on another question on the experimental design is, for the Siberian jays, the only species tested in the wild, you got a score of 0. Would you think that there might be a captivity effect at work for the species tested in captivity, i.e. training?
So we can, of course, we cannot rule this out. And we also discussed this in the paper that unfortunately we don't really, since we had only this one species tested in the wild, we have no way to rule out that, for example, the coordination didn't happen, because it's not that the Siberian jays never landed on the apparatus. So they, every now and then, one individual would land on the apparatus, and they all were, like, apart from one individual, we even managed to train all of them to actually use the apparatus. So they were actually doing great in this respect. But it is not impossible that the zeros for the provisioning rate were there because they could not coordinate well enough in time and space, because basically, although we have very large aviaries in our captive setting, for example, still the individuals they live within this aviary. So if we put an apparatus there and start working with them, they kind of know that this is an interesting thing, and they will be close enough to see that something is happening. Whereas a bird in the wild, the territory is large, so the bird might just be like 5 trees over and might not even be here on time to get the food that was delivered. So yes, this is a very good point, that the very low rates in the Siberian jays might also be due not to a lack of pro-social tendencies, but due to a lack of coordination in this setting. And it will be very interesting to test the Siberian jays, for example, in a captive setting, because they are, similarly to the New Caledonian crows, they also have this family living style. So if we really want to probe the importance of family living, we would have to give the Siberian jays another fair shot at also showing their pro-social tendencies, maybe in a captive setting where it's more easily comparable to the other species.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we just have a couple more questions for you. I'm kind of moving away from the experimental research and more towards the ecology of these corvids. So we have one question on ecological stress. Does the stress, for example, unpredictable resources, impact how much prosociality you see in corvids?
And the short answer is I cannot really answer that, because I don't think that it has been done. But for example, one thing that we know in the corvids is that the environmental stress, so how limited resources are, for example, contributes to how much they rely on cooperative breeding. So that in years, for example, where there's plenty of food around, and then you will see more of the individuals within a group breeding themselves in azure-winged magpies or the closely related Iberian magpies. So in years of plenty, then many pairs will maybe attempt to breed themselves and raise offspring themselves, whereas in very harsh environments, then they rather rely on cooperative breeding. So if you spin this a little bit further, like if you take this on, this thought, then it is an interesting thought that maybe, especially in harsh environments, you also need to be more pro-social within the group than in not so harsh environments. But unfortunately, I'm not aware whether there's any empirical studies on that.
Okay, thank you. And on the development of prosociality, do you have an idea of what age these prosocial behaviors begin to develop in corvids?
Wonderful questions. Would love to investigate that. We have no idea. Really would be very nice. I mean, the one thing that I can say is that, for example, in the azure-winged magpies, the one bird that did not pass the knowledge probe, she was a juvenile. So, but that doesn't say that she was not pro-social, because she actually landed a lot in the pro-social test as well. But maybe at least it tells something about their inhibitory abilities, that maybe she didn't pass the knowledge probe because she couldn't inhibit landing also in the two control situations. But yeah, it would be a wonderful study to look at how this develops.
Yeah, that will be really interesting. Okay, and a final sort of pair of questions on the evolution of prosociality. By focusing so much on corvids and primates, because they are large-brained, do we make these skills appear more cognitively difficult than necessary? Would theories hold, for example, if sparrows would do the same? And then a similar question for the flip side, could it be that enhanced socio-cognitive skills are more likely to explain proactive pro-sociality or instrumental help, but pro-sociality may be more widely present outside primates or corvids?
I do think it's very important not to confound these two things. And yes, I think like for the first question, yes, I think it would be extremely important not to look only at corvids and primates because they are so smart, because just as the person said, like if this is a general principle, then it should also hold for individuals that for species that don't have not yet been found to show such high cognitive abilities. And I don't want to claim that sparrows are not clever, because maybe they are very clever and we just don't know it yet. I think so far the evidence, especially from the cooperative breeding hypothesis, does not support the fact that it is necessarily connected to high cognitive abilities. And also from our experience, like with the corvids, we know, for example, that the ravens have very highly developed social skills and social cognition. So there's a lot of evidence for their abilities to take the perspective of other birds, to cooperate, to evaluate different situations. And yet they did not show any not any, but they showed less pro-sociality in this task. So if you would ask me for my hunch, I would say that the degree of pro-sociality is not necessarily connected to high. So it's not the higher your cognitive, socio-cognitive abilities, the more pro-social you are, because you might also be rather using your high social cognition, your high skills to actually compete with others rather than cooperate with others.
Yeah, well, all just provides us so much material to develop future research in primates, corvids, and hopefully lots of other species. So I think that's a good place to wrap up for the day, and just say thank you again so much, Lisa, for a wonderful talk. Thanks for joining us on Primate Conversations, and thank you to everyone watching for joining us this term. If you've missed any talks, they are all available on our YouTube channel. And the Primate Conversations series will return on Tuesday, 27th of April at 4 p.m. UK time with a talk by Julie Lesnick on edible insects and human evolution. So we look forward to seeing you all again then. And thank you very much.